Today, Sweden is a quiet and peaceful country, a nation with an amazing standard of living, but hasn't fought in a war for 200 years, and somehow managed to keep out of both world wars and the Cold War, weathering the 20th century. This hasn't always been the case. There was a time in the 17th and 18th centuries when Sweden could have easily been one of the world powers. Swedish warrior kings led their crack armies down into Germany, Poland, and Russia, almost winning a couple times. It may come as a shock to many, but there was a point in the early 18th century when Sweden came within inches of conquering Russia. In the year 1700, Sweden controlled Finland, the Baltic coast of Russia, Estonia, northern Latvia, and small parts of Germany. This was the result of 100 years of good leadership. Sweden's power worried the other Baltic powers, namely Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Thus, when the King of Sweden died and was replaced by his teenage son, these three nations decided to team up against Sweden. Very unluckily for them, the King of Sweden, Charles XII, turned out to be a military genius. The Russian army was smashed at Narva, followed by the conquest of Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark. He then turned on Russia, marching a large army from Poland into the heart of the nation. The Russians, led by Peter the Great, had spent the last few years modernizing to deal with the Swedes. In our timeline, Peter created a scorched earth policy to starve the Swedes as they marched across Russia. With winter approaching, the Swedes turned southwards to the grain-rich fields of southern Ukraine. This area was controlled by Tartars and Cossacks, enemies of Russia and Turkish vassals. They promised the King of Sweden supplies if he could arrive. In our timeline, Peter was able to rout the Swedish army at the Battle of Poltava, thus preventing them from continuing their invasion of Russia. But what if the Swedes had won at Poltava? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. In this timeline, the Russian line breaks at Poltava, and their army is crushed. The Swedes go into the Ukraine over the winter and resupply there. They re-attacked Russia the next year, driving towards Moscow. Let's say Peter the Great isn't able to stop them again, and the Swedes seize Moscow. As a person who has played an enormous amount of Empire Total War, I can assure you that the Swedes could not have won if the Russians did not give up. Russia is simply so enormous, and there are too few Swedes to occupy it. However, as a historian, I can tell you that at this point, Russia was so disorganized and messed up that it might have simply fallen in on itself if placed under too much strain. This wasn't the Russia Napoleon or the Germans faced. This was an unmodernized and barely knit-together nation, one practically still in the Middle Ages. So for this timeline to work, let's say that after the Swedes would occupy Moscow for a long time, Peter the Great isn't capable of keeping Russia in the war, and the Russians agree to moderate peace terms proposed by the Swedes. This would include returning Poland-Lithuania to its borders at its apex in the early 17th century. Keep in mind when I say Poland-Lithuania, I'm talking the Swedish puppet state, and so remember this is basically giving it into Swedish hands. This would move wealthy areas like Kiev, Smolensk, and much of western Russia into Swedish hands. The Swedes would also take Karelia, Peninsula, and northern Russia, and move the border away from the Baltic in the north, giving them important cities like Pskov. This would lead to enormous changes in Russia. Peter the Great would be completely discredited for his humiliating loss against the Swedes. In our timeline, he was basically the man who made Russia. He modernized its economy, military, culture, navy, government, and practically everything imaginable. He destroyed the power base of the boyars, or nobles, who had dominated Russian politics for hundreds of years. This allowed Russia to become the world power it is in our timeline. In this timeline, he would be considered a fool, and Russia would never be able to modernize. In this timeline, Russia would be a lot like the Turkish Empire, huge in size but primitive in technology. Modernizing Russia required all of Peter the Great's genius skill, and without him no one else would do it. Without Peter the Great, we never would have seen Russia grow to become a major world power. It would simply lurk to the east of Europe, worrying economists over its potential, but absolutely no one else. Meanwhile, the Swedish Empire would be brutally overstretched. Ethnic Swedes would make up less than 10% of the population of the new empire they had built. This would result in the next few decades of Swedish policy being the consolidation of the new empire into something manageable. This would likely involve reaching out to local, especially Polish, aristocracies, and moving Swedish settlers and garrisons across the empire to create connections across it. Sweden would thus not do any expansion in this time period and would be vulnerable in the meanwhile. The rise of Sweden would disturb the balance of power in European politics, with the effective neutering of Russia and the wipeout of Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark. This would worry Austria and secondarily France, who would be further away. We would likely see a war in the 1720s or 30s, which the Austrians would likely invade southern Poland and seize regions like Ruthenia, Volhynia, and the area around Krakow. The Swedes would be so far from their supply lines and home that the Austrians would likely be able to take control of these regions, thus setting the balance of power back to an acceptable modicum. This would result in the Swedes hating the Austrians, and thus, when Prussia and France would invade the Austrian Empire, the Swedes would support them. I honestly think that southern Poland is simply too far from Stockholm, and too close to Vienna for the Swedes to reconquer and hold it, though. However, this support from Sweden would allow Prussia to defeat the Austrians and still rise to power. This is more important than it may sound if you don't know a lot about history, because Prussia was the nation that united Germany into a single country from hundreds of little dukedoms and principalities. After the War of Austrian Succession came the 7 Years' War, started by Britain and France's competition over colonies in America. In our timeline, this pitted France, Austria, and Russia against Prussia and Britain. Sweden would join the latter alliance in this timeline. It would make sense that after 2 generations, Russia would also want a rematch against the Swedes, and so would try to ally with France and the Austrians to do so. This would of course fail. Military technology would be more important than the last war, and the Swedish position stronger, while Russia would linger in the Middle Ages, resulting in a humiliating defeat. The rest of the war would be the same. In our timeline, the 7 Years' War was a pretty stirring Prussian-British victory, and I can't see why a Swedish addition would change this. In our timeline, Sweden had a brief colonial empire that, yes, did briefly colonize Delaware, along with parts of West Africa and what would later be Ghana. They lost these colonies to the Dutch and the Danes before the Great Northern War, many of who in turn were taken by the English. The conquest of Denmark would put some of the African colonies back in Swedish hands, and the addition of all the Atlantic ports of Norway and Denmark would make Sweden a much more likely colonial power. With the rise of Sweden as a European power, we would likely see the Swedes expanding their colonies in Africa again. Delaware, however, by this point, would be densely settled with English-speaking Quakers and Southerners, making a Swedish reconquest very unlikely. In our timeline, the southern part of Ukraine and Russia was settled by nomadic Cossack and Tartar tribes, the descendants of the Mongols. The region was mainly unsettled, and the story of the 18th century, in our timeline, was the push of the Russian farmers south towards the Black Sea, pushing away the nomadic tribes and the Turks, who they followed. In a matter of 40 years in the 18th century, the region turned from unsettled pasture land to some of the most fertile and populated lands in Europe. The Swedes were allies of the Turks, making the destruction of their vassals a big no-no. Also, the already overstretched Swedish Empire wouldn't have the resources to destroy the nomadic tribes and would be mainly facing west towards Europe rather than east towards Russia. This would mean that the region would remain under the nomads as technology would advance. Turkish settlers would likely either slowly replace the native population, or with the adoption of agriculture, the native tribes would skyrocket in number. This is what happened in Romania and Moldova, where the semi-nomadic peoples developed agriculture and then skyrocketed in number. In Asia, we would still see the Russian Empire spread east across Siberia. This had already happened by the start of the Great Northern War, with them already reaching the Pacific. Fighting against the primitive native tribes wouldn't really need advanced technology. Napoleon would still likely be born in this timeline, being in Corsica, which is pretty far from any major events of this timeline. Also, the French Revolution would likely still happen, with everything that led to it still existing. This would mean that we can still expect the Napoleonic Wars to happen in this timeline. Sweden, as a major stakeholder in the European system, would be pitted against Napoleon and France, and Napoleon, as a military genius, would likely crush their armies and conquer Poland. It's not that simple. The Swedish Empire would be unstable from the beginning, simply due to the puny number of Swedes and the disparate nature of the empire. This meant that when France, with its enormous armies, would invade, likely promising freedom to Poland, they would be able to wipe out 100 years of Swedish control like dust in the wind. Sweden would retreat to Scandinavia, maintaining independence in its homeland and maintaining an illusion and memory of when it was the most powerful nation in Europe. It would ally with Britain, the other nation in a similar state, and stay allies with the Ottoman Empire, all worried by the sheer power of France. The Swedes and Britain would turn to the colonies and navies to keep growing, while the French would control the continent. They would have dreams of reconquering the continent, likely exacerbated by large Swedish populations on the continent, a relic from the empire. With Austria being a French client state and the French already having an enormous empire, it would mean that the Ottoman Empire would likely survive much longer. I'm not sure if this means they would be able to reform and survive to the present, though. This timeline also has the unintentional side effect of making Poland a powerful nation. To be brutally honest, the region between central Poland and Moscow has very little identity. Nations need geographically identifiable borders to exist. Look at how the US is the nation from sea to shining sea, or how India is flanked by mountains and the sea. This region, though, is very flat, and with no geographically discerning features. This makes it very easy to conquer. For that reason, historian Timothy Snyder called it the Bloodlands. That means that the identity is very fluid and often imposed by outside conquerors. Having Poland, even a French or Swedish government, remain in control of the region would result in a huge part of Eastern Europe thinking of itself as Polish, not Ukrainian or Russian. This would make Poland an enormous nation. Also, being conquered by Western powers instead of the Russians would likely result in Western technologies, especially agricultural ones, spreading throughout Greater Poland. This would likely result in this region being more technologically advanced and glued in with the rest of Europe in this timeline. Walking from Kiev east into Russia would be like walking from Europe into Asia. This would mean that if Poland ever gained independence from France, it would have a very high chance of becoming a major European or world power if it made the right decisions at the right time. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment, subscribe, or support me on Patreon. Thank you.